In the beginning of Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, the Rambam writes that the months that we go by are lunar months. We go based on the moon. And one of the psukim the Rambam brings is actually from this week's Parsha, HaChodesh HaZelochem Rosh Chodashim. On the other hand, the years that we calculate are solar years. And the Rambam brings the pasuk, Shomer es Chodesh HaAviv, we need to guard the month of Aviv of spring. So what this means is that the cycle of the moon around Earth is approximately 29 and a half days. The cycle of the sun around the earth is 365 and a quarter days. That's the full cycle of the sun around the earth. And what the Rambam is teaching us over here is two halachas, that the months of the year, we go just based on the moon itself, just the cycle of the moon. It's not as if we take a solar year and we divide it into 12 as many of the nations do. And this is why we refer to it as Chodshei HaLevana, it's months based solely only on the moon. On the other hand, since Pesach needs to be in the time of spring, Shomer is Chodesh HaAviv, and the seasons of the year are clearly based on the cycle of the sun, this is why we go by the solar year, and that's what our seasons will be based on. And every 2 or 3 years we'll need to make a leap year in order to synchronize these two types of years, because the solar year will be 11 days longer than 12 of the lunar months, and this is why we need every once in a while to have a leap year. The Rambam in fact goes on to say that these days as well, when we make the calculations of the calendars, we have a cycle of 19 years, in which 7 of those will be leap years, 12 of them will be regular years, and that way after 19 years, more or less, the sun and the moon years will be completely synchronized, besides for 1 hour and 485 chalokim, which is a bit less than a half hour. So under an hour and a half, there will be this discrepancy after every 19 years. So the Rebbe brings a question that the Mefarshim ask, and that is that seemingly after many years of this hour and so adding up after every 19-year cycle, we're going to end up with a situation that Tkufas Nisan, that is the season of spring, will end up being in the month of Iyar. And the commentator called a Pirush that asked this question concludes that Mashiach will come and answer this question. The truth of the matter is, the Rebbe says that all the way till the end of the 6,000 years of this world, still spring will still start somewhere in Chodesh Nisan. However, the Rebbe says this doesn't completely answer the question, because it's all very nice to say that spring is still in Chodesh Nisan, but the problem is that we need Pesach to be in Chodesh Nisan. Shomer is Chodesh Aviv, we need to have Pesach to be in Chodesh Nisan, and based on these remainders after every 19-year cycle, the Rebbe says there was already many, many years, even back in the times of the Rambam and before that, that the season of spring was starting after the beginning of Pesach. So the Rebbe says, perhaps we could explain it based on the following. The Rambam actually speaks about 2 different ways of calculating the solar year, of how long the solar cycle is. And the one that we just mentioned about the solar year being 365 and a quarter days, 365 days and 6 hours, that's the calculation that's called Tkufas Shmuel. And after a 19-year cycle, we have an hour plus a bit left over, remainder. However, there's another calculation, which later on we'll see that the Rambam calls that the more accurate calculation, the more real, true calculation, and that is that the solar year is slightly less than those 6 hours, 365 and a bit hours, not a full quarter of a day. And based on that, after a 19-year cycle, in fact, there will be no remainder whatsoever, and therefore Pesach will always fall out in the spring based on that calculation. However, the problem with this is, if the point of aligning the solar year and the lunar year is because of Shomer es Chodesh HaAviv, and if we say that based on the calculation of Shmuel, we're not really getting there exactly, because we are going to have Pesach already, spring starting after Pesach has started, how does the Rambam say that the reason we put this calculation together, this 19-year cycle, where there's only a little bit of remainder, is going to help us with this idea of Shomer es Chodesh HaAviv, when seemingly it's in fact not helping at all, because Pesach is still not in spring. So the Rebbe says that we could explain this based on the wording of the Rambam, where the Rambam says that the years are the solar years, because the pasuk says Shomer es Chodesh Ha'aviv, which seems to be telling us that according to the Rambam, there's two things over here. It's not only that Pesach needs to be in the time of spring, but there's also an idea that we want to sort of keep the general solar year aligned with our months, meaning to say that Pesach, Nisan is always falling out around the same time within the solar year. As far as Pesach is concerned, it's true that according to this calculation of Shmuel, it won't work. But the general idea that Nisan should still be in the time of spring, as far as that's concerned, that will work. So in other words, what the Rambam is telling us is that yes, according to Shmuel, this inaccurate calculation, if we want to call it that, the one that's not as accurate as the second calculation, which we're going to call the Tkufa of Rav Ada, according to this, yes, it's true, Pesach is not always going to be in the time of spring, but at least Nisan is in the time of spring, and that's also important to the Torah. However, the Rebbe says, the question is like this. If we anyways need to have the cheshbon, the calculation of Rav Ada, the other calculation, which is more accurate, where the solar year is 365 days and a little bit less than 6 hours, we're going to need that anyways in order to make sure that Pesach is also within spring. Then why do we even need to bother to make sure that according to Shmuel, according to the first calculation, we're saying, well, at least Nisan is also in spring, if we basically going to need to end up with other calculation as well anyways? Says the Rebbe, the point of the explanation is that the truth of the matter is, even though we don't count Shmuel as the 100% accurate calculation, nevertheless, from the fact that the Rambam brings this calculation as well in halacha, it tells us that this calculation is also a true calculation, and we also paskin halacha is based on this calculation. In fact, the Rebbe says there's many halachas that are related to the seasons of the year that we look specifically at that calculation of Shmuel. For example, the concept of birchas hachama, the bracha that's made once in 28 years on seeing the sun at exactly the same location where it was the first time it was put up into the sky at the beginning of creation. The way of calculating that particular idea is based on the tkufa of Shmuel. So how do we understand this? That on the one hand we're saying it's not an accurate calculation, and yet in many areas of halacha we are still counting it. Says the Rebbe, in order to understand it, we're going to explain it based on another general famous question in the halachas of Kiddush HaChodesh. And that is that if Beis Din was Mekadosh the Chodesh, if they sanctified the new moon, saying that today is Rosh Chodesh, even if for whatever reason it was not an accurate calculation based on a mistake or otherwise, the halach is that that day is still holy and Rosh Chodesh. Now the Rambam of course says, because the same God, Hashem, told us to listen to Beis Din, just like He told us to keep Rosh Chodesh. But the question is, how do we understand it? How is this day becoming Rosh Chodesh if it's not the day of the new moon? So the Rebbe explains that really the idea of the sun and the moon down here in this world are representing and are nishtalshel, they come down from the sun and the moon the way they are in the spiritual realm, Beruchni Yisrael Yanim. And what's making it really Rosh Chodesh is when there's a moiled halavana l'mayla up in the spiritual realm. But since we have no way of tuning in and understanding and knowing when things are happening l'mayla, we go based on the calculations down here. When we see the new moon, we know, that means there's a new moon up above, and that's what's making it Rosh Chodesh. But if for whatever reason Beis Din ended up making a different day Rosh Chodesh to what we see down here, what it means is that really, because Hashem obviously made it happen this way, that really Rosh Chodesh was on the day that Beis Din said. In other words, up above that is when the Moilad was. For whatever reason, because the world wasn't suitable, wasn't fitting, wasn't roy, it didn't end up coming down in this world as well, exactly the same time as up above. Says the Rebbe, the same thing is true with these seasons. When we speak about that certain calculations, according to Shmuel, we don't see how they fit down here in this world, what it means is that when we're paskening la halacha regarding these tkufas, what we're saying is that up l'mayla, yes, that is exactly the time of the tkufa. In other words, the calculation that Shmuel is giving us for this world, it's at that moment when the tkufa, when that particular season starts up above, or that the sun has entered that particular place within the sky for us to make the birchas hachama. And therefore, even though it's not happening down here in this world, what we are saying is that up l'mayla beruchni Yisrael Yanim, that's exactly when it's happening. Says the Rebbe, but you might ask, that of course every Inyan in Torah, first and foremost, has to have its simple meaning down here. Pshutei shel mikra. We need to understand the halachas the way they are down here in this world. And if we're speaking about seeing the sun or seeing the moon, we have to be able to see it begashmius. Birchas Hachama is a mitzvah that's associated with when we see it with our physical eyes. How can we say that it's only happening in the spiritual realm, this calculation, and down here it's something else? Says the Rebbe that the truth of the matter is, when we have a look at the way the whole seasons work, so this is connected to another machloikus in the Gemara. And the Gemara says that we know that there's a machloikus between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua when the world was created. Rabbi Eliezer says in Tishrei, Rabbi Yoshua says in Nisan. And many of the Mefarshim explain that it's not really a machloikus. That practically Begashmi is the world was created in Tishrei, but B'machshava in Hashem's thought, the world was created in Nisan. Now here is something very, very interesting. In the halachos related to the seasons, the tkufos, we always start counting the first tkufa when it all started. We actually go back to the year before creation. We start going back to that Nisan, to the time when the sun and the moon were placed in the sky, even though we're speaking about a spiritual time. It's only in Hashem's thoughts, so to speak. But that's the way all the seasons work in our calendar, based on that. Says the Rebbe, what do we see from here? That when it comes to the idea of the tkufas, the idea of the seasons, we are going back to a space that's before our Gashmi Yizdika world, to a space in Hashem's machshava, to a ruchni Yizdika realm, and therefore it makes sense to say that as far as the tkufos, as far as things that are related to the seasons are concerned, yes, we are going to counting it based on something that's happening up above, even if down here it's not fitting with the Gashmi is the calculation the way we see it down here. Says the Rebbe, if that's the case, we now need to understand the other way around. Why is it that when it comes to Pesach, we say no, that Pesach must be also in the time of spring, not only Nisan in the time of spring. We said that Pesach needs to be in the time of spring, and that's only going to work according to the accurate calculation down here, which we call the Tkufa of Rav Ado. Says the Rebbe, the reason why certain seasons don't end up being down here the way they are up above is, as we said before, the world is not roy, is not fitting to be able to accept the things the way they are lamaila. But that's only as far as the world is concerned, the mitzias of the world. But the whole idea of Pesach is a Torah-dike mitzias. Pesach is a Torah-dike entity. And therefore, as far as Pesach is concerned, the inyanim, the tkufos, the seasons, the way they are up above, are expressed also in the way they are seen down here in this physical world, because as far as Torah is concerned, the things need to be expressed also down here in our world. Whereas inyanim to do with the world, not directly Torah itself, Metzius of Torah, but rather with the things the way we see in the world, that could be that it's going to work according to the Tkufa of Shmuel, which again means that certain things are happening l'mayla and we don't necessarily see it in our world. Says that this is why when the Rambam says that we rely on the calculation as far as the years are concerned, we go based on the idea, the 19-year cycle, which we said is going to end up that only Chodesh Nisan is within the time of spring, although regarding Pesach, we said Pesach needs to be in the time of spring, and that we're going to rely on the first of the calculation of Rav Ado, the more accurate calculation. But as far as the year is concerned, it's good enough if Chodesh Nisan is in the time of spring, because as far as the matters related to the world, we said that the Tkufa, the way it's up above, is going to be according to the calculation of Shmuel, and therefore in the halachas related to the year, this is going to fit with the way Shmuel's calculation works. Again, that not necessarily down here is exactly the same calculation as up above.